established. Our meetings with journalists and MPs confirmed that it is expected to introduce criminal penalties and possibly jail sentences for those who spread quote unquote disinformation online. The law would cement the government's control over one of the last major spaces for free expression in Turkey, and in combination with last year's social media law, increase pressure on social media companies to become complicit in Turkey's censorship regime. We found that while government officials have stated both publicly, and we also heard this from different people during our mission, that there is a claim that the law would be modeled on measures passed in other countries, particularly Germany. And this comparison is false. The German law, in this case, the reference is to the NetzDG law, does not regulate, let alone criminalize, disinformation. And moreover, even as many of our groups have criticized, in fact, German legislation regulating social media platforms, such as the one that is referred to, Germany's independent judiciary can offer redress in the case of rights violations, whereas Turkey's courts are not independent and do not provide protection against the abuse of such laws. These are key differences which are not acknowledged. Meanwhile, the mission also found an alarming rise in government efforts to discredit independent media that receive foreign funding. This has recently culminated in a new bill that was introduced by an individual MP from the MHP party, which proposes mandatory registration for organizations and individuals that receive funding or are influenced in some way by foreign entities. Regardless of whether this particular bill will ultimately pass, the point is that it signals that this issue of pressuring foreign funded organizations is on the government's agenda. And this is, in our view, an alarming prospect in an environment in which Turkey's remaining independent media are already demonized and face financial pressure in a heavily captured media market. We, the mission delegates, discussed these various law proposals with opposition MPs of both the Human Rights Investigative Committee of the Parliament, as well as the Digital Platforms Committee of the Turkish Parliament. And unfortunately, I must add here that the chairs of the two commissions from the ruling AKP party did not respond positively to our requests for a meeting.
Led by International Press Institute and IPI Turkey National Committee, the mission included representatives from Article 19, the Committee to Protect Journalists, English PEN, the European Center for Press and Media Freedom, Human Rights Watch, Norwegian PEN, Observatorio Balcani Caucaso, Trans Europa, PEN International, Reporter Without Border, and Southeast Europe Media Organization. From October 4 to 8, mission delegates met in Ankara and Istanbul, as well as online, with editors, journalists, local civil society groups, Turkish MPs from various political parties, members of government, regulatory bodies, foreign diplomatic from 23 countries, European Union officials, representatives of leading global tech companies, and Turkey's Constitutional Court. The meetings confirm an even worsening environment for Turkey's remaining independent press ahead of planned presidential and parliamentary elections scheduled for 2023. In addition to the threat of growing digital censorship, journalists continue to face arbitrary prosecution and judiciary harassment through anti-terror, defamation, and other laws. There has been a profound erosion of rule of law in the country, and the judiciary is largely politicized and enabled, with the partial exception of the Constitutional Court, to protect fundamental rights. Indeed, virtually all interveners highlighted the lack of the independent judiciary as the root of Turkish press freedom problems. Despite the judicial reform strategy announced with much fanfare 2 years ago, little progress has been made to reverse this situation.
So thanks, that was Errol Underroller from Reporters Without Borders, and now I pass it on to Dimitri Batoni from OBCT.
So, in a meeting with the Turkish Constitutional Court, which despite the overall climate continues to play a key role in protecting fundamental rights, the mission urged the TCC to speed up decisions involving violations of press freedom. Mission delegates noted that many of the TCC positive rulings have nevertheless come late for the victims. In some cases, the TCC has not yet issued a ruling despite a severe ongoing rights violation, including the detention of journalists. The refusal by lower courts in a number of cases to implement Constitutional Court decisions was also a central topic of discussion. Meetings also confirmed that political capture of state institutions extends beyond the courts to include key regulatory bodies such as the Radio and Television High Council, RETÜK. Ilan Tahci, a RETÜK member nominated by the opposition Republican People's Party, CHP, told the delegation that the independent television broadcasters faced a growing number of arbitrary fines and broadcast bans, even as pro-government media almost never face sanctions despite public complaints. The mission had requested an official meeting with the RETÜK chair, nominated by AKP party, but did not receive a response. The delegation also raised concern in its meetings over the rising number of physical attacks on journalists in Turkey and corresponding impunity for the assailants. The mission urged members of the Parliament Human Rights Investigative Commission to specifically examine this issue on a cross-party basis. In view of the global problem of increased surveillance of journalists by governments, the delegation also raised concerns about the apparent absence of parliamentary oversight over the use of surveillance technology by Turkey, including against journalists.
Thanks, Dimitri. And finally, passing it on to Özgür Öret from the Committee to Protect Journalists.
In briefings with the European Union delegation, as well as representatives from 23 foreign embassies, the mission, while acknowledging existing efforts, called for stronger public solidarity with journalists under attack, as well as more robust criticism of Turkey's co-opting of the digital space through the social media and disinformation codes. For the first time, the international mission did not receive a positive reply from a meeting from any government office. Requests to the Justice Minister and Transportation and Infrastructure Minister, as well as Communications Directorate of the Presidential Office, did not receive a response. The Council of State declined the meeting. This prevented an exchange of views with representatives of the government on these critical topics and precludes the mission from directly including their government's perspective in a full report to be published later this autumn.
Thank you, Ms. Good, and thank you all for bearing with us as we read the statement, but we thought it was important to give you our full conclusions, and we'll also be distributing the statement later in both English and Turkish, so you have this, and as I said, we will be opening up the questions so we can have more of a dialogue on the findings. Before going further, I'd like to pass it back to Errol Underroller from Reporters Without Borders to give a brief summary as well in Turkish of the issues that we discussed.
Merhabalar arkadaşlar. Öncelikle hem hibrit ortamda hem de burada bulunan arkadaşlara ilginizden dolayı teşekkür ederim. Sınır Tanımayan Gazeteciler Türkiye temsilcisi olarak IPI'nin öncülük ettiği bu yılda bir gerçekleştirilmeye çalışılan çalışma ziyaretinde aslında bizim açımızdan ne gibi bir özgün tarafı olduğu ile ilgili birkaç cümle etmek isterim. Yarım saat kadar aranızda bulunabileceğim için şimdiden özür diliyorum. Bu kanaatlerimden sonra zaten diğer meslektaşlarım size kendi açılarından bu 3 günü değerlendireceklerdi. Scott'un da belirttiği gibi bizim için yılda bir gerçekleştirmeye çalıştığımız bu çalışma ziyaretlerinde ilk defa Adalet Bakanlığı veyahut ona bağlı kurumlardan olumlu karşılık görememenin bir şeyi var, arka planı var. Geçen yıl veyahut ondan önceki yıl Covid ortamında gerçekleştirdiğimiz bir toplantıda bizler somut eleştirilerimizi getirdiğimizde bakanlık yetkilileri bizleri insan hakları eylem planı ile durumu güzelleştirmeye çalışmışlardı ve dolayısıyla bir diyaloğun pek birbirine karşılık gelmediği bir ortam yaşamıştık. Fakat toplantılarımızdan en verimli geçen birisinin de Anayasa Mahkemesi ile gerçekleştirilmiş olması da bizim açımızdan hani hedeflediğimiz sorunların adresine gidebildiği ve işlerlik gösteren bir mahkeme ile aslında pekala etkili bir diyalog muhafaza edilebildiğini gösterdi. Bu bizim için hayli önemli oldu. Elbette görüşmelerde bizim muhataplarımızla bir araya gelişimizde 2023 seçimlerine giderken aslında milletvekillerine kadar ama daha ziyade gazeteci meslektaşlarımız ve hak kuruluşlarını meşgul eden bir endişeyi de gözlemledik. Yani süre giden yasal baskılar dışında bizim tespit ettiğimiz klasik diyelim ihlaller dışında aslına bakarsanız özellikle 2019 yerel seçimlerinden sonra baş gösteren gazetecilere yönelik siyasi nitelikli saldırılarında artış yaşanabileceği ve sosyal medya yasasından sonra dezenformasyon sahikiyle sosyal medyaya getirilmek istenen ağırlaştırıcı hükümler ve son günlerde bizim çalışma ziyaretimiz sırasında gündeme gelen yabancı fonlardan yararlanan medya kuruluşlarına yönelik düzenleme teklifi aslında 2023 seçimlerine giderken gazetecileri veyahut onların çalıştığı medya kuruluşları daha geniş anlamda da sivil toplum örgütlerini nasıl bir tedirginlik ortamına sevk ettiğini gözlemleyebildik. Dolayısıyla bu tedirginlik havasını da Avrupa Birliği Delegasyonu ve Britanya Büyükelçiliği ev sahipliğinde 23 ülkenin diplomatik temsilcileriyle paylaşma fırsatı bulduk. Çok yönlü tehditin aslında bu son 10 yılda dize getirilmeye çalışılan eleştirel medya veyahut bağımsız medya kuruluşları özelinde ne kadar bir ağırlaştırıcı etki olabileceğini bizler gözlemledik ve Ankara'da bir araya geldiğimiz araştırmacı gazeteciler ki Türkiye'nin önde gelen gazeteci meslektaşlarımızdan aslında bu baskıların Ankara'da akreditasyon, toplantılara alınmama, basın kartlarını keyfi şekilde reddetme gibi idari şeylerle, idari kıskaçla ne kadar ağırlaşabildiğini de bir kez daha görmüş olduk. Dolayısıyla uluslararası kuruluşlar, hak kuruluşları olarak bizim bu 2 günlük, 3 günlük çalışma ziyaretinden aldığımız temel ders, geçmişte yaptıklarımızın yanında, gösterdiğimiz dayanışmanın yanı sıra ileriye dönük olarak süreci çok dikkatle izlememiz gerektiği ve en yapıcı şekilde meslektaşlarımızla, Türkiye'deki meslektaşlarımızla dayanışma içerisinde bulunmamız gerektiğidir. Dolayısıyla Bu çalışma ziyaretini düzenleyen Aype'ye bir kez daha teşekkür ediyorum. Ve bizlerle bu meseleleri görüşmek için olumlu ortam sağlayan, fırsat veren siyasi partilere ve Avrupa Birliği ülke ve delegasyonuna da, Anayasa Mahkemesi'ne de bu diyaloğu sürekli kıldıkları için de teşekkür ediyoruz. Çok sağ olun.
Thank you very much, Errol. And at this point, I would like to see if there are any questions. So a reminder to those of you who are joining online, please feel free to put your questions in the chat here on Zoom. For those of you who are here in person, just raise your hand, and it would be great actually if you can go then to the laptop so that you can also be seen to ask your questions. We have a couple of first questions. We have one question coming in online which asks, it seems that the committee, I believe meaning us, has not met with government officials. And the question is, what would be the potential effect of your report on press freedom in Turkey? As we stated as we mentioned up here already, we made numerous efforts, in fact, to meet with ministers. Both the justice requests were sent to both the Justice Minister, to the Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure. Those requests were not answered. We also requested meetings with the AKP chairs of the Human Rights Committee and Digital Platforms Committee. We did not receive a positive response. We received a negative response from the Council of State. And we also received we did not receive a response from the members of RUTUK who were nominated by the AKP. So unfortunately, and this is actually the first time that we did not receive any positive response by at least one government institution. And the effect of, there are two effects really. One effect is that it takes away the possibility to have some type of exchange of views with the government on these extremely important issues, and prevents us. And the second effect is that it prevents us from including those views, even if we disagree with them, in our report. And of course, we as organizations try to be as fair as possible in terms of including different views. Again, even though we disagree with them or we think they are not founded, we still make efforts to include those views and try to give the full picture. And unfortunately, without being able to have these meetings with the government, we cannot include those views directly. We can include what we learned from public statements or what we learned from the media, but this isn't the same thing as being able to sit down to share these views and at least have some sort of conversation. And I think that closing that door is unfortunate, because again, to at least have that conversation is something. So it doesn't affect the report, I think, in terms of the content, because we will have a strong findings and a strong report, which will be well founded based on many sources. But that aspect will be missing, unfortunately. We have a second question, which is asking about, could you provide, meaning us again, could you provide more information on the capture of public media in Turkey, which I must say was not a direct focus of this mission, so it didn't really come up in the meetings. I don't know if any of the colleagues up here would be able or willing to comment on that issue. Otherwise, we move to another question. I believe what is meant is, TRT.
I think in Turkish media or in English. Yeah. Tabii 2 günlük ziyarette, Ankara ziyaretinde gündeme gelen bir boyut değil. Fakat TRT'nin ve Anadolu Ajansı'nın statüsüyle birlikte iktidarın kendi ideolojisini yaydığı sektörler itibariyle bugün gelinen yayıncılık durumu aslında herkesin vergilerinden oluşan, kalkınan veyahut işlerlik gösteren yayın kuruluşları olarak herkese hitap eden ve vatandaşa eşit mesafede veyahut sektörlere eşit mesafede, siyasi partilere eşit mesafede hizmet eden kurumlar olmaktan oldukça uzaklaştılar ve kutuplaşan siyasetle birlikte, kutuplaşan medya ile birlikte Anadolu Ajansı ve TRT ne yazık ki toplumun birkaç kesimini hiç yokmuş gibi ele alabiliyor. Dolayısıyla seçim süreçlerinde çok daha fazla bu polarize, kutuplu bakış kendisini gösteriyor. Gerçek anlamda demokratik ülkelerdeki kamu yayıncılığına baktığınız zaman aslında ideolojik ve politik zehirlenmenin herkesin vergileriyle işlerlik gösteren kamu yayıncılığını bir hayli sakatladığını hepimiz görüyoruz. En son da işte 22 yıllık bir çalışanını bir sosyal medya paylaşımından dolayı kapı öne koyduğunu biliyoruz bu kamu kuruluşlarının. Dolayısıyla araştırmacı gazeteciye dayalı ama her şeyden önce 10 yıllardır emek vermiş insanları bugün kendi ideolojilerini yansıtmadığı gerekçesiyle kapı önüne koyan kuruluşlar oldular. Bu da tabii bir medya sektörünün sağlıklı işlemesi bakımından büyük sakatlıklar oluşturuyor.
Thank you, Errol. We have another question also coming online asking us specifically, did the Presidential Communications Office respond to our request? No, they did not. Are there any other questions, either on Zoom or in person? If not, I mean, meanwhile, if you think of some more questions, I would just maybe share a few other points. The first is that, and this was also mentioned in our statement as well, but a little bit down. So I would just repeat this, that we have registered over the past year or 2 years, I would say, growing physical attacks on journalists. And this was something that we raised in a number of meetings, and connected to that actually impunity for those who are responsible for these attacks. And that is also connected to long-standing impunity cases of journalists who were killed. Of course, there were allegations earlier this year, explosive allegations made related to previous murders of journalists. And we also repeated calls that we previously made as organizations for those allegations to be fully investigated. But we have seen an alarming rise in physical attacks, and we have not seen a corresponding investigations or accountability that would be necessary to stop further attacks. So this is quite a big concern of the mission. In addition to everything else that is going on, this has actually been on the rise. The second point that I wanted to mention, which was also alluded to in the statement, is the question of in the broader question of media capture. We talked about regulatory capture of Brütug, for example, but I think it's also important to mention BEAK here, which is the press advertising agency. We also know that independent media are being systematically discriminated against when it comes to public advertising, also advertising that is put out by companies which are connected to the state. And I think that this also needs to be, this was an issue that also came up during the mission. This has been a long-standing issue. We have media outlets that have received bans, public advertising, ongoing bans, and you know, I think it's very clear for us that these are happening in an arbitrary fashion, and they are having an economic impact on the remaining independent media in the country. And again, this is happening in a wider environment of what we call media capture. We also know that the much of the mainstream media has been also captured through different ownership networks that are close to the state. So this is a phenomenon that we also observe in other countries. The misuse and misappropriation of public advertising is an issue that we observe in a lot of countries, but it is definitely present in Turkey. And I do want to also have mentioned that issue as well. So those would be two additional issues that I just wanted to add. I don't know if anybody else would like to add any issues that haven't been fully covered from your point of view.
I may expand on the safety,
yeah,
if you want. Well, as my colleagues have mentioned, we are very disappointed that we weren't able to meet with any government officials, because the meetings we had, we did not have the opportunity to talk about some of the issues, because the people we will meet were not the right people. Journalist safety is one of them. As Scott said, we see an alarming attack towards physical attacks on journalists, and this comes from regular citizens, the police, and some attacks, you know, that they have to be premeditated before. And most of these attacks do not get a proper prosecution. I have talked to dozens of journalists throughout the years. Not one of them was hopeful about the outcome of the investigation. A lot of them were not even being questioned by prosecutors as victims. And again, most of them did not pursue the case that they were the victims of. And when you talk about journalist safety, of course, you need to mention the arrested journalists. Another thing we wanted to ask to the government officials, Turkey suddenly stopped arresting journalists this year. We do not see new journalists being sent to prison for a quite long time. But this does not mean the harassment, the judicial harassment towards journalists has ended, because they are either sentenced and released pending appeal, or while on trial, they are released under judicial control, which means you need to go to a police station and offer signature frequently. And that in itself, although arguably better than prison, is still an attack on press freedom and still limits the ability to journalists to work. Thank you.
Thank you. We also have, I believe we have a few questions in Turkish, which I am not able to process. So I would ask also one of you coming, I think there are some questions in Turkish in the chat.
Anayasa Mahkemesi yıpranma hakkınız ile aleyhte kararlar aldı mı? Kararlar aldı. Son olarak AYM'nin çeşitli kararlarıyla nasıl düşünüyorsunuz?
Anayasa Mahkemesi'nin aslına bakarsanız biz çokça yerel yargının yerine koyma gibi bir kısmı bir hata yapıyoruz. Fakat Anayasa Mahkemesi'nin kararlarının gecikmeli olduğu, pilot dava kararlarının az olduğu temel eleştirilerini yaptıktan sonra şunu da teslim etmemiz gerekiyor. Anayasa Mahkemesi gazeteci haklarının çeşitli boyutlarıyla ilgili aslında son birkaç yılda anlamlı kararları var. Gazetecilere yönelik şiddet konusunda, erişim yasakları konusunda ve son olarak da Cumhurbaşkanı'na hakaret düzenlemesiyle ilgili olumlu kararları var. Çeşitliliğiyle bu tatmin edici. Dolayısıyla temel bir sorunu şu şekilde görebiliriz. Anayasa Mahkemesi bu olumlu kararları alıyorsa peki, ki bunların bir kısmı pilot dava olarak da görülebilir. Neden yerel yargı bunu sistematik şekilde uygulamıyor veyahut neden yerel yargı bu sorunları yeniden üretmeye devam ediyor? Bu temel bir sorun. Zaten hem ideolojik bir background'u var hem de yargının kendi iç eğitimi ve niteliğiyle ilgili bir tartışma var. Her şeyi Anayasa Mahkemesi'ne belki atfedemeyiz. Fakat orada dile getirilen sorunlar ki heyette yer alan bazı kuruluşlar sadece medya özgürlüğü veyahut o kapsamda faaliyeti olan kuruluşlar değil. Dolayısıyla barışçıl siyaset konusunda veyahut örgütlenme özgürlüğü konusunda söz alan arkadaşlarımız Anayasa Mahkemesi'ne neden kararların bu kadar ağır, önemli ve sembolik dosyalar olmasına rağmen neden kararları yıllara bıraktığını eleştirisini açıkça dile getirdiler. Ama temel karşılık olarak, kısmi olarak eleştirilerimizi de kabul ederek Anayasa Mahkemesi işte yılda 60.000 dosyayla yüz yüze kaldıklarını ve bu pilot dava geliştirme konusunda ve Anayasa Mahkemesi kararlarının yerel yargıda uygulanıp uygulanmadığının takibiyle ilgili çeşitli mekanizmalar geliştirdiklerini söylediler ve bunlardan bir tanesinin de Kararlar Müdürlüğü olduğunu ifade ettiler. Dolayısıyla her şeyin mealen, her şeyin biraz da irade meselesi olduğunu ortaya koymuş oldular. Anayasa Mahkemesi'nin aslına bakarsanız yapabildikleri içerisinde belki de in terms of positive ruling, Anayasa Mahkemesi'nin olumlu kararları ile ilgili bir şey söylemek gerekirse Beyza Kural kararı ile ilgili Diyanet muhabirinin elleri arkada kelepçelenerek gözaltına alınmasına girişilmesiyle ilgili verdiği ihlal kararından sonra arkadaşlar İstanbul Asya Ceza Mahkemesi'nde 3 polis memurunun yargılanmaya başladığına tanık olduk. Elbette Cumhurbaşkanı'na hakaretin de ile ilgili kararın da yerel yargıda karşılığını görmek isteriz. Elbette diğer yasal tacizle ilgili de bu meselelerin yerel yargıda özümsenmesini bekleriz. Ama evet, Anayasa Mahkemesi ile ilgili buranın bir onarma makamı olduğunu veyahut kurumu olduğunu da görmemiz lazım. Dolayısıyla Adalet Bakanlığı ve meclisle ilgili de raportörleri yoluyla yasa talep etme veyahut işte görüş bildirme yönünde de girişimlerini eksik etmediklerini söylüyorlar. Ama artık parlamentonun da işlevinin eskisi kadar olmaması, eski düzeyde olmamasının da getirdiği bir kopukluk olduğunu da bizler de fark ettik birazcık.
Thank you.
Misyonun gerçekleştirdiği temas ve ziyaretlerin değerlendirmesi yazılı olarak da yapılacak mı? Yapıldığında kamuya açık olarak yayınlanacak mı? Evet, bu yapılacak. Biz de ayrı olarak yazacağız. Ayrıca IP'nin detaylı raporunu da gelecek haftalarda okuyabileceksiniz.
So I think you explained the rule.
Yes, yeah, detailed report from IPI will come and be
Sure. Sure. Exactly. Thank you. And Errol, back to you.
Arkadaşlar, yani toplantıdan ayrılacağım için şunu belirtmeden geçemeyeceğim herhalde ve hepimize de aslında bu tür bu mesajları almak da iyi gelecektir. Türkiye'de gerçekten eleştirel medya ve bağımsız medyanın karşı karşıya kaldığı tehditler yabana atılır değil. Uluslararası medya temsilcilerine kadar idari ve cezai tehditler sirayet etmiş durumda birçok yıldır. Şunu demek istiyorum. Biz bu ziyaretler sırasında görüştüğümüz araştırmacı gazetecilerden aldıklarımız, Evrensel ve Fox TV'ye yaptığımız ziyaretlerden ve hepimizin yaptığı çalışmalardan şunu da biliyoruz. Türkiye'de baskılar var fakat bu baskılara karşılık hak arama yollarının da bir hayli zorlandığını da biliyoruz. Yani o hal komisyonuyla veya Bakanlar Kurulu'yla darbe girişiminden sonra kapatılan yayın kuruluşlarından Hayatın Sesi Televizyon mesela Anayasa Mahkemesi'nde olumlu bir karar. Daha doğrusu Anayasa Mahkemesi bu konuda olumlu bir karar da aldı ve bu yasal yolları zorlayan televizyon kuruluşlarından bir tanesi de Hayatın Sesi televizyonu. Şiddete karşılık mahkemeye başvuran birçok arkadaşımız var. O kazanımları da izliyoruz. Dolayısıyla hepiniz büyük bir dayanışma ağının bir parçasısınız aslında bakarsanız. Uluslararası medya, işte Yabancı Medya Derneği, işte Gazeteciler Koruma Komitesi, Sınır Tanımayan Gazeteciler, IPI, tüm bu kuruluşların Türkiye'de 10 yıllara aşan bir dayanışma deneyimi var. Dolayısıyla yani bu bir sağlamlığa da karşılık geliyor ve her şeyde biz bu şekilde Ankara'da kabul gördüysek ve bizim sağladıklarımız da çeşitli kurumları besleyebildiyse demek ki biz aynı zamanda ilişkilerimiz itibariyle sorunlarımızı ulaştırmaya devam edebiliyoruz. Yani bu pozitif tarafları da görmekte fayda var. Çok teşekkür ederim.
Thank you very much, Errol. We have one more question in the chat about whether we can amplify our assessment of the relative independence of the Constitutional Court. I would answer this question in this way. I think we believe that the Constitutional Court still has a very important role to play in protecting fundamental rights in Turkey. I think that, Errol, you also addressed this already in some of your comments in Turkish. And our meeting with the court was intended to raise some concerns that we have about, in particular, the delays in the rulings of some of the court. We noted some positive rulings, as I believe you already mentioned, Errol. However, the problem is that these rulings simply come too late. That by the time that the ruling has come that confirms a rights violation, the damage has been done. There's no way to really redress the harm that was caused. And this is a huge problem. And it's also a problem that we have cases that have still not been resolved that refer to ongoing rights violations. So ongoing deprivation of liberty, jailed journalists, for example, ongoing website blockings where we have a daily denial of access to information to the public. These are very serious rights violations that we believe need to be addressed with much greater speed, even if eventually a decision may come in favor of fundamental rights. And we also have serious concerns about whether lower courts are following the Constitutional Court rulings. I think many of us know that in many cases, in a number of cases, that has not been the case. Unfortunately, there are different programs in place to try to redress that problem. We are unsure about what the outcome of that process will be, because I think it's also clear that the lower courts are under political pressure, that the problem is not just whether they understand the decisions of the Constitutional Court or they understand the jurisprudence, but obviously there are other issues. And until the problem of judicial harassment and the problem of the independent judiciary as such is solved, I think it will be difficult to solve this problem as well. But in sum, I think it's important to underscore that we see the Constitutional Court as still playing a very important role in Turkey. It is the last source or last institution of redress for rights violations, at least before the European Court of Human Rights. And we brought a number of concerns to them in order to strengthen that role.
Can I add something? Not about the Constitutional Court, but we are giving a very grim picture, one that we can hard deny. But at the same time, every time we pay a visit, we also realize how the strength and the resiliency of Turkish journalism. And I think it is an important thing that should be reminded of. There are many organizations that were born, even in recent years, as a reaction to the shrinking space of free media. And it is important to remind that these initiatives deserve our attention, our respect, and our support. And support can come in many forms. First of all, I think there is no greater satisfaction for Turkish journalists struggling to make his voice heard than having a public, like following this media, constantly hearing their voices is fundamental. At a time in which probably the possibility to reach financial resources will be even more shrinking, it is important to continue to find creative ways to give the possibility to these alternative models of conducting journalism to continue to exist and to be heard. And also it was mentioned during our meetings that support can come in different forms. And for example, technical support was mentioned at a time in which also digital spaces are being closed or shut down and so on. New technical resources, new technical initiatives are needed So these kind of contributions can come from everywhere. Every student, every technician, every engineer can come up with suggestions, ideas, possibilities. So it's literally a call for all coming together and offering on the table new solutions and new opportunities. And I think that beyond paying attention to the issues, we need to pay attention also to the opportunities.
Thank you, Dimitri. And I think just to wrap up, just one final comment, maybe also trying to end on a somewhat positive note. I think that we also know that what is happening in Turkey in terms of pressure on media freedom is not just happening in Turkey. We have a number of countries around the world where press freedom and freedom of expression are under tremendous pressure. We see growing nationalism, growing efforts to undermine the credibility, to smear critical journalism, independent journalism. And I think that this is also a global issue that also needs a global response, that requires global solidarity from organizations that are working on these issues, as well as journalists. And I think that today we also had the news that the Nobel Committee awarded this year's Nobel Peace Prize to two journalists, Maria Ressa and Dmitry Muratov, who have spent their careers working as independent journalists, but also dedicating themselves to the defense of free expression and press freedom. And I think that this prize today has given us an opportunity and additional momentum, I think, to push for this global response and a global pushback against these forces that are trying to silence journalism, again, not just here in Turkey, but around the world. So I think that we can also take that as a positive message that corresponds with this final day of the mission and take that forward.
Maria is a board member.
And yes, Maria Ressa, who is also a board member of IPI and also close, I think, to many of the organizations here. So it's a great, actually, pleasure that this award was announced today. And also Dmitry Muratov is also someone that we know, so it's great news, and I think it's also great news for press freedom. As I said, I hope we can take this as momentum for our work. So just want to thank everyone for joining this conference. Thank you to those of us who joined online, joined in person, and also thanks to everyone who met with us during this week to share their views. And again, we look forward to publishing our findings in more detail in the months to come. So thank you very much.